It was a summer evening, although it was later in the night than this, but it was June 4th, 1949, when one of the most tragic events in the history of the city of Richfield occurred. Welcome to a special edition of Out and About in Richfield. We're going to tell the story on this particular show of the tragic shooting of Officer Fred Babcock. As I said, it was June 4th, 1949. It was about 2 a.m. in the morning, somewhere around there, when a resident living across the street on Garfield Avenue looked out and saw that there was activity occurring at the back of what was then the National Tea Store, which was located basically at on the 7600 block of Lyndale Avenue. And of course, Garfield backs onto Lyndale. The resident called the police. Two officers are dispatched, Officer Babcock and Officer Poulter. They were in a squad car about 68th and Lyndale. Arrived on the scene. Poulter went out of the car to go walk through the yards to get up at National Tea to go check out the back door. Officer Babcock was with the police car, rolled it up here on Garfield Avenue, and got the drop on the getaway car. Within minutes of that happening, there were gunshots, and Officer Babcock lay in the street, basically right here in the boulevard area, mortally wounded, and died shortly thereafter.
And what's so fascinating about this tragic story in the history of Richfield is that we have still with us today a Richfield resident, a police officer who responded to this incident, Floyd Roman. And Floyd is going to really take us through the details of that night and then the subsequent incredible chase that went on to apprehend the criminals that were a part of that tragic night in Richfield back in June 1949, right?
Right.
So
let's take it away and hear the story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we're back now with Floyd Roman. Floyd was a police officer with the city of Richfield back in 1949 when the shooting of Officer Fred Babcock occurred. Floyd started with the police force in about June of 1947, I believe.
47.
And then I think in about 1968, you went with the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension.
That's right.
My interest in this story came when I found an old copy of this front page detective magazine from October of 1949. And one of the major articles in here was all about, it was called 100 Hours of Hell, the story of the shooting of Richfield officer Fred Babcock, and then the subsequent 5-state chase and kidnapping and everything that occurred. And you know, I have been associated with the city for nearly 30 years, and I knew of the shooting of Fred Babcock, and I see his picture over in the police department, but I never realized the complexity of the story. But I think we're so fortunate to be able to retell the story with somebody who was actually there at the time this occurred. And so I guess what I'm going to do is, Pam and I would like you to just tell us a little bit about what happened that night, June 4th, 1949, when Fred Babcock was shot.
Well, I remember I was in bed, of course. This occurred shortly after midnight in the early morning of June 4th. And I received a call from the chief of police that Fred Babcock had been killed by some burglars and to get over to the station as soon as possible. The other officers were similarly called that were off duty. I was paired up with another officer, and the other officers were also paired up. I went immediately to the scene at 76 in Lyndale, observed what was going on there, and got the information that I needed. And I learned at that time that the details of the shooting and so on. It seemed that Fred and Lee Poulter received a call that there was a burglary going on, and it was being observed by a family in a home. Their last name was Reynolds, and they were keeping an eye on what was going on. So Lee Poulter and Fred Babcock proceeded to the scene with the idea that Lee was going to be dropped off at the corner of 76 and Garfield and Fred would pull up behind the suspect's car.
Can I just stop for a second? Now, we look at 76th and Lyndale right now, and of course there's the large Twin City Christian home facility there. Back in those days, obviously Richfield in 1949 was a whole lot different. Lyndale was a main thoroughfare. You went across the bridge basically into cornfields that were in Bloomington. The National Tea Store, which was one of the major grocery stores in town at that time, was located kind of on the corner of basically 76th and Lyndale. And then there were kind of the south side of that block, sort of.
Yes, that's true.
And then the homes, like the Reynolds, they were living at, I think it was 7620 Garfield. Now,
Yes.
that of course that block doesn't exist anymore. It's part of two developments. But so when they went down to the scene, as you said, they were going to somewhere on that block of Garfield, looking at the back of what was then the National Tea Store.
Yes, Reynolds could see the back of the back door of the National Tea. They could also see, of course, the car in front of their place, and the lookout person who was stationed right next to their house almost.
Did they see that lookout person or at
Yes,
the time?
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, they did. Okay.
And so at any rate, the plan was to drop Lee Poulter off at the intersection where he would run down to that back door and try to apprehend the person breaking in there. Meanwhile, Fred would pull up behind the car, not knowing who was in it or how many people, and get them out of the car. Well, as Lee was proceeding down there, Fred had pulled up behind the car, got out, hid behind the car door and the car itself, pointed his gun at the suspect car, yelling for those people to get out. And instead, there was fire back, several of them striking Fred, and I learning later that the first bullet is the one that really killed him. But it hit him with such force that it threw his gun that he had in his hand over the squad car to land on the boulevard to the right side. Poulter, hearing all the shooting, and the suspect down at the store, they panicked. Well, not panicked, the suspect panicked, but Poulter came running back up to see what happened. The suspect started running back up also to that car. Well, the car pulls out, leaving the suspect behind. So he goes back down to Lyndale Avenue and takes off towards Bloomington.
Okay.
Meanwhile, Lee finds out what happened and called the ambulance, and it was too late for any.
I mean, Fred basically
He was
died
killed
right there at the
instantly,
scene.
yeah.
You
And
said
he had been how long on the force
Yeah.
at that time?
He started 6 months after probably 16 months.
And he was how old at the time that he was killed?
He was 26.
26.
you said, Floyd, that he was shot with such impact. They found out later what he was shot with was a .30-30 rifle.
That had been stolen in a burglary earlier by the same people.
One of the shots went through I understand, through the radiator of the police
Yes,
car.
yeah.
One shot actually severed his jugular vein. And a .30-30 is, I mean, a .30-30, that's a high caliber rifle to be
That's right.
to be shot with. I can understand why it would cause such trauma. And actually, as the cars were speeding off, I understand that Lee Poulter was shot at the car as it was leaving, and that's one of the reasons they sped off so fast. Leaving, actually, there were 4 people involved. There were the 2 people in the car, which were brothers, right? There were Carl Bistrom
That's right.
and Arthur Bistrom.
Right.
They were in the car. The man who started running off down towards the Bloomington cornfields, that was Gustav Johnson, is
That's
that correct?
right. That's
And there was another man who was in the store at the time, I think, unless I have that wrong, named Hartman.
Yeah, he was more or less the lookout man.
Okay,
He was with the Bistroms.
he was with
He
the
stayed up there at the top of the.
Okay,
It's kind of a hill going down.
But how did he get away from that scene? Did
Well, he jumped back in the car. He was
jumped in
so
the
close
car.
to it. Yeah.
Okay.
okay.
And who actually did the shooting out of this, group of
Carl, the younger
Car-
brother of the.
Carl
Arthur,
Bistrom
yeah.
actually fired the shot. So those 3 got away in the car,
Right.
leaving Gustav
Yeah,
running
on its own.
Running
his
on foot.
own, running south towards Bloomington.
Yeah, he didn't go across the Lindale Bridge. He went across Old Highway 5, which is now 494.
Okay.
And Bloomington was primarily farmland out there. Well, Richfield was too for a large part of it. But he disappeared into the cornfield in Bloomington.
And so then the chase was on, I assume.
Well, now I'm on the scene after this happens, and these other officers. And the Minneapolis police sent out one of their key investigators. The Hennepin County Sheriff sent out 2 of their key investigators, and Edina and some of the other communities joined in trying to find this person. But the corn was fairly tall, and it was dark. We had no idea where he was. And then we had heard of these bloodhounds down in La Crosse, Wisconsin, that they had helped other police departments. So a call was made to this person down there, the owner of the dogs, and he said, "Oh man, it's going to take me a couple hours to get up there." Well, that's all right. We didn't care. So we kind of waited around while some of the cars were out patrolling looking for this person. But in all that cornfield and farm area out there is pretty difficult. Well, the dogs finally arrived, 2 of them, with the owner. And I had never seen bloodhounds work before, and I always had some doubt about it, their ability to do what they said they'd do. Well, Gustav had dropped his glove, and of course the crowbar that he was using to try to get in the door. The dogs got a sniff of that glove, and off they went. I mean, they don't walk, they run. And he's got them on leashes, and he's running after him. And the last I remember seeing him, he's going into a cornfield on the other side of the highway. So we go out, or we started to go out, my partner and I think it was Russ Peterson, to maybe get ahead of him to see, or at least keep eye on him if he goes across the street, which there weren't too many of in Bloomington at that time. Then we get a call, or we hear a call that the Minneapolis detective and the 2 Hennepin County deputies who were in the same car had apprehended Gustav. And it was out on, we said, we'll be right out there. So we went out Lindale, and some reports in the paper, I remember, said that it was on Lindale, but I remember distinctly driving up to, it was either 88th or 90th Street, and all those side streets were gravel at that time. But I remember going on a gravel street to the right of Lindale going south, and meeting their car there, and they had Gustav in the back seat. And I remember one of the officers in the car, he says, "You see that officer standing out there pointing to me?" He said, he worked with Fred. He's a buddy of his. You want to get out and talk to him? Well, but anyway, Gustav was wet almost up to his neck because of the early morning dew on the corn. And very meek, sitting back there like this.
Mm-hmm.
Floyd, the actual shooting happened about roughly 2:15, 2:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
It was Friday night, early Saturday morning of June 4th.
Morning.
So about different reports put it around 2:15, 2:30. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't recall that.
So the time that the Gustav Johnson was apprehended probably was what, in the wee early morning
It was getting
hours, starting to get light.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is all still happening early Saturday morning, June 4th, 1949.
Now, another thing we had to think of at the time is Mrs. Babcock knew nothing of this. And somebody had to get over there and notify her before she'd hear it on the radio or something in the morning. So Lee Polder and I got that assignment.
Oh.
And it was not an easy thing to do.
Oh.
I'm sure not.
And they had 2 small children?
Two
right?
small children.
And so you had to go over and actually share
Right.
that news with her.
Of course, she broke down.
Yeah. Floyd, we'll talk in a second about what happened to the other 3, but let's go back to Fred Babcock for a minute. Mm-hmm. Fred Babcock joins the force the same year you do, 1947.
About 6 months later.
6
so
months.
It was 48 when he came.
Actually 48?
Yeah.
Okay. He was a war veteran,
Yeah,
fought on Tarawa. He was a Marine, wasn't he? He was.
I knew he had over 3 years, and a lot of that time was in the South Pacific.
Right.
He had medals you wouldn't believe.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So it was so ironic that here you have a man who was fought on Tarawa and in the South Pacific, makes it through 3 years in the World War II, comes back to Richfield and ends up getting ambushed in his
Well, in
first
a sleepy
year and a half.
little
in his-
town.
at that
Yeah,
time.
And at that
Barnum
time, how
come
big?
in
I mean,
almost-
how big was the police department at that time? Like
Well,
you
there was
said,
a,
maybe
well, with our addition, yeah, there was a chief and 7 people.
7 people.
Yeah.
A lot of farm fields, and
Yeah.
I bet this is something that you would just never comprehend or really.
Well,
I mean,
that
how often
was
would
a
something
shock.
like this happen that you'd have a gang come into town and
Right.
actually shoot an officer?
Well, and the 2 officers, again, Lee Poulter and Fred Babcock, those were the only 2 officers on duty for the whole city that night.
That's the way it was normally.
Okay.
2 officers in 1 squad car to handle all of Richfield.
So then Gustafson, he's in custody. Now the authorities know who else is involved in this. The other 3, apparently they make a small stop at St. Paul, where they're based out of St. Paul, I believe.
Yeah,
The Bistroms and Hartman, and then they take off on their chase.
Right.
And they head up towards North Dakota.
That's right.
And they go to North Dakota, and then what happens?
Well, the next morning, this would be on the 5th, a Mandan police officer stops him, Mandan, North Dakota. He's working alone, and several residents saw him stop this car, and they thought it was a traffic stop. Well, he goes up to the car, and they point their guns at him and kidnap him, take the squad car, and take off from there. And they went about 500 miles, I believe, in that squad car, and they had the officer drive about 100 of those 500 miles.
From North Dakota
From Mandan
through
down into South
Dakota.
So that's really a sign of desperation when you're willing to, kidnap another officer, take
Yeah.
his squad, head on this incredible chase.
Well,
'Cause they're trying to elude I'm sure we're trying to track them down very.
to hide themselves, so to speak, from being recognized, they tore off the red lights, tore off the antenna. And I should mention that the dispatcher up there heard Officer Sen, who was the officer kidnapped, call in for help. And later on, a couple of voices came on, strange voices to the dispatcher that said, "Forget the last call, the situation is well in hand."
All right.
So anyway, then down to South Dakota they went. They finally, a roadblock was set up in McIntosh, South Dakota, but they went right through that, kept going. Then, either because the engine of the squad car burned out, so to speak, because of their crazy driving, they kidnapped a young 16-year-old boy in his car who was coming home from a date or something, and they took him, they dropped him off later on, but they proceeded on, and they kidnapped some other people to change cars. There was a total of 5 stolen cars in this chase.
And even didn't they take a family hostage or something in their home for a while?
Well, that's where this developed into a big operation police-wise. There at one time were 11 planes flying around looking for these suspects. One of these planes evidently flew over the car that they were in. So they want to hide. They pull into this farmyard under the trees. They go in, and then this thing you referred to happened. It was the wife I think was 20-some years old, the husband not much older. A couple of farmers. The husband was out at the field at the time. They come into the house, take over, and they stayed there for a while, had coffee, and Art Bistrom decides this is enough for him. So he tells the others to take off, he's staying, he's going to give up. He held the gun on the husband comes back, he was working out in the field. He comes back, so they're all being held there by him. He held him for a couple hours to let his friends get a good head start.
Sure.
Then he turned the gun over to the farm couple and told them to call the sheriff.
And I think what had happened also in that meantime, now, the older one, Arthur Bistrom, who was
Yeah.
about 37, 38 years old.
37.
Okay. He was married, and apparently his
Yeah.
wife had gone on the radio
Yes, that's
and,
true.
and really was imploring her husband to give himself up. She'd rather have him serve some time in prison than be shot. And that, I think, weighed, it was part of the decision
Well, yeah.
that Art made in terms of deciding to give himself up.
Well, supposedly he made the statement, "I don't go for the violence." See, a burglar normally is not a murderer.
It's a different,
They're in their own setting, so to
Yes.
speak. So he had enough.
So things had just gotten way out of control
Yeah.
as far
Yeah.
as he was concerned. So his younger brother Carl and,
And
then this Hartman,
Hartman were
they were
together.
the one. They took off.
You're right.
So they were still on the loose, trying to get away.
Yes, they proceeded down into Nebraska now. In fact, Nebraska, they were in Nebraska. That's where that farm was where Arthur gave up. But they proceeded on, and there had been a tremendous rainstorm. And they come to this bridge, which was washed out over a creek. Down they went into the creek, were badly injured. So Hartman, dazed, was able to walk up to a farmhouse and ask for help. Well, the farmer there, he gets a neighbor, and they put a shotgun in the car. They drive down to the scene, and they see two people in there. Now, this is strange. See, there were only two left. Well, Hartman's up at the house. So it was later found out that the second person in the car was a hitchhiker that they picked up on the way. Now, why they would pick up a hitchhiker, I have no idea.
They weren't making a lot of good decisions anyway.
They used to be doing everything in threes. I don't know.
But they were both badly, they were bleeding.
And you have
dazed.
pictures of that in here, I believe,
Yeah.
as far as pictures of
That was-
when they were captured and they were injured from the
From
car
the
going
hospital,
down into the...
yeah, right.
Uh-huh.
So the farmer happened to be the brother of the sheriff. So he calls the sheriff, and of course that's the end of the story as far as the flight. There's
And that's-
prosecution came up later on.
And actually that all happened in Kansas, I think.
Well,
Or was it-
Marysville, Nebraska, which is right on,
On the Kansas border?
border.
Okay.
Yeah.
All
But
right.
it's very, they liken it, I think, in that detective magazine to sort of the Jesse James kind of, when Jesse James came riding into Minnesota, and then he took off on this same kind of 5-state tear.
To get back to
That
Missouri.
This really was kind of the modern day, same kind of scenario.
Well, it was a big event because it got nationwide attention, and I remember later on, after all this was over, that we got contributions when there was a request for money for the family. Fred had just given up his GI insurance, so they had nothing. And then several things happened, which we can talk about a little bit later. But
Sure.
I know money came in from as far as California and Florida for the cause of the family. Of course, there was Fred's funeral, and that was kind of touching too. The pallbearers were myself and other Richfield officers. And I remember as we came out of the funeral was conducted down at Waylander Quist on I think it's 23rd and DuPont, because we had no funeral homes out here, Well, then there was the burial, of course, as you see with the Marine firing squad. And about 10 days after the murder, the village then decided we should have a Fred Babcock Day to help the family, to raise some money for him. Oh, and I should say that all the merchants closed their stores during the funeral that afternoon. From noon till 3:30, they were closed in respect to him. Well, there were a number of events that took place to raise money. The grocery stores and other stores, they gave part of their proceeds from that day to the Fred Babcock family. We had an entertainer who lived in Richfield, who later became a councilman here. He was called Slim Jim, but his real name was Ernest Iverson. And he was a country western radio type, and he played at some establishments in Minneapolis and around. And he had connections, of course, with a lot of people in entertainment. The Ink Spots happened to be in town at the time, and he asked them if they would come out to perform in a fundraising thing for Fred's family. And they agreed, and they came out and did it without charge. So eventually, all of this ended up in raising almost $10,000 for Fred's family, which at that time was quite a bit of money.
Yeah.
Right.
And the same as the GI insurance, it was $10,000. And I had dropped mine just like Fred did too, so we were all kind of in the same boat at that time.
Right. Well, you know, it is a touching story when you talk about what the community did then to show their appreciation and to help the family of Officer Babcock. I think most people know that the Richfield VFW post was, the Fred Babcock VFW post was named after, of course, after Officer Babcock. But there's another piece of the story that's interesting, and of course it involves you and the Babcock family. Now, after this event, a couple years after, I believe, Fred had a younger brother.
That's right.
And he joined the Richfield Police Force.
That's right.
And he became your partner.
Yeah, he was one of my partners.
One of your partners. Well, for the many, I know the 20-some years you were here, but he was a partner of yours.
That's right.
And he was a partner of yours at the time that another very significant event happened in Richfield, and I'm talking about July 1951. And that's a topic for another show. We're going to bring Floyd back to talk about the time that he was partnered up with Fred Babcock's brother when a tornado ran through Richfield in July of 1951. So folks, you're going to have to wait for that story, but it'll be coming up soon. An interesting story, I'm sure, and we have here a repository of some just amazing history in the city of Richfield, and we're going to get those shows together and get that out to you so you can see it during our 100th anniversary year. So, thank you, Floyd. It was a pleasure talking to you about this. I think that it is so important that that people in Richfield have this history to look at, because, you know, even with all the years that I've spent at Richfield, I had no idea of the complexity of the Fred Babcock event and what took place, and it's something that's got to be preserved for Richfield history. So we're so fortunate to have you tell the story. So, until we see you next time on Out and About in Richfield, take care.